Welcome to the Spoken Tome Media podcast series. In this edition, Mark Jeftovic speaks with Charles Hugh Smith, the author of A Radically Beneficial World. For more audiobooks that are the voice of reason in a world gone mad, visit us online at SpokenTome.media.
Mark, I want to start by saying I do want to thank you very much for investing your time and money in this audiobook for A Radically Beneficial World. I mean, it's like a fantastic thing to me that you see the potential or, are enthusiastic about the ideas and are willing to make it happen. And it's like a miracle. It did happen. And I know it took a lot of effort.
Well, thanks for saying that. I wanted to thank you for the same, for allowing me to make my first audiobook out of A Radically Beneficial World, because that's an idea that I just couldn't get it out of my head for the longest time, that I wanted to make audiobooks. And I do most of my reading in the car, it seems, these days, listening to books. And so I would want to make an audiobook out of a book that hasn't been made into one yet. So when yours came along, I thought, it's time to stop thinking about it and start doing it. I'm just going to start in on some of my talking points here.
Yeah.
Okay. I've been a long-time fan of your work. I think I first became aware of you on a Peak Prosperity podcast with Chris Martinson. And, every year for Christmas at Easy DNS, I give a book to everybody on staff. And so far, 2 years, I've given a copy of one of your books to everybody here. This last Christmas, it was A Radically Beneficial World. And that's a testament to, how I view your work. I think it's really important that the word gets out as much as possible. And every time I read it, every time I listen to it, I come away with some fresh aha moments. And I'm particularly fond of the way you break down very big ideas into very compact definitions, the way you distill complex topics into, succinct maxims, like the fact that systems have distinct outputs, and those outputs are based on the behaviors they optimize. Who the participants are is secondary to that. And I think that's a very important point that people have to understand. So, speaking of systems, let's start there. Let's start with the monetary system. Can you take us through how, in its current state, it institutionalizes inequality?
Yeah. Oh, very good, Mark. And I, as a person who is, understands technology really well, i.e., it's easy, I think, for you to get the idea that all systems, whether they be in the human realm or in the straight technological, have inputs and outputs, and there's this black box where stuff happens and you get an output. and it's like what we're really talking about is exactly what goes on in that black box between the input and the output. And so with the money system, what we have is what happens in that black box is money is created at the very top of the wealth pyramid, right? It's created by central banks and other very large institutional banks. They're the only players that get to create money out of thin air. And then that money is distributed to the top of the pyramid as well. In other words, you and I can't go to the Federal Reserve and say I want to $1 billion at 0.5 of 1% interest, which I can then buy a treasury bond at 3.5% interest and make 3% for doing nothing. We can't do that. So then the money is at the top of the pyramid, and then it's supposed to magically flow down that pyramid to the bottom. But of course, that's not actually what happens. It stays at the top, where the rich get richer. And so that's the input and that's the output.
Yeah. Us technology types also have the phrase garbage in, garbage out, which is similar to what you're talking about. We're talking about what goes into the black box dictates what comes out of the black box. And I suppose if inequality goes in, then that's what's going to come out. So when they do it at the top, it's called quantitative easing, and when it's done at the bottom, it's called counterfeiting. So Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've always had this personal maxim. When I sort of think about my thoughts around political models, that I think if it's illegal for you and I to do it, then it should be illegal for the state to do it as well. At what point, when you aggregate enough of you and I's together, does something that's illegal and ostensibly immoral magically become legal because enough of us have grouped together into some ephemeral entity called the state that now blesses this with a veneer of legality? So,
Exactly right, Mark. And we can talk about that symmetry and asymmetry, and that the way the system is constructed now, the risk is pushed down to everybody in the system, but the benefits are kind of congregated in the top, because if you can create money out of thin air or borrow it for essentially nothing, then you can buy Uh, income producing assets. You can outbid anybody else that's just, like a regular person that's saved up the money or has to pay, 5 or 6 or 10% for the money. So those people with access to what I call free money for financiers, they can basically buy up the entire world. And that's part of what we're seeing, is that a normal person that just is using their savings and bank money, we can never compete with people who can borrow unlimited amounts of money for basically nothing. So I think the other thing you mentioned, though, is that there's a moral component here, and that's a lot of what a radically beneficial world is about. Is that it's kind of calling out the current system as completely immoral. I mean, there's no moral justification for the current system. It is morally corrupt and destructive, and that's something that we don't really think about, or we don't say.
yeah, you generally don't say that in polite company, that the system that we live under is morally bankrupt or
Yes.
has no legitimacy. But further to that point, one of the things I wanted to have you expand on was distinguishing between earning a profit and maximizing gain. Because one of the things, I'll just briefly interject this, one of the things I do like about your work is you go nowhere near the traps of collectivism, Marxism, socialism, which a lot of people do when they make it to step one and realize that we live in a bankrupt and immoral system. They kind of fall down the leftist path. I don't want to get too much into partisan politics or anything like that, but they kind of go towards Marxism. Let's eliminate money. Let's make everything free for everyone. Your work, you recognize the value of entrepreneurship, the value of capital formation, the value of being able to earn a profit, and yet you do make those distinctions between profit, maximizing gain at any cost.
Right. And if we to make as an entrepreneur and business owner yourself, it's crystal clear to you the difference. But to the average employee, or the someone who works for someone else, they tend to lump it together. Like somebody that is just using financialization tricks to make millions of dollars, but not contribute anything to the economy. They haven't created a single job. They haven't created a product or service. That they get lumped in with people who've created goods and services to generate profits. And so I think what we need to do is, as an alternative system that I lay out, in the book, is we need to strip away all the easy ways of maximizing gain without creating any goods or services or paid work. And so if we make that very difficult, if not impossible, then we're already gonna have what's left is a system in which people are rewarded with what we could say positive incentives, like you're going to make a profit, you're going to make your life better, you're going to accumulate capital because you're part of a process that's creating needed goods and services that are filling scarcities. And that's what, in what we might call the natural economy, um, that's what creates value, is filling scarcities. People are willing to pay you more in whatever they have, if something is scarce, right? Scarcity attracts value. So and that's a pretty simple mechanism, but it's remarkably effective in understanding the economy. And I wanted to speak to a good point that you raised about the attraction of Marxism. And I did study Marx and for like a whole year in the university, because it is his critique of capitalism, at least certain aspects of it, is very powerful, and also his idealistic view. In other words, his it failed in the real world, but we all have an idealistic side, and so we have to believe in a system, in the rightness and the goodness of a system, to get excited about it. And so in a radically beneficial world, what I try to do is lay out, hey, here's a model that we can idealistically get excited about, that's democratically based, it's community-based economy, it allows every participant to build capital and get paid for the work. And it's very dynamic, meaning that it's not centrally planned. It's more like the internet. It's decentralized and it's self-organizing. So, like for an individual, if this system comes to pass, it's like I get to join whatever group I want. And then if that group chooses a work project that I disagree with, well, I can quit and go join another group, or I can start my own group. But each group project has to follow some really basic rules, and those rules are what keep the system integrity in place. And so, in other words, you've really got to eliminate privilege, which is the other characteristic of our system. Not only is money created at the top of the pyramid, but privilege is created and maintained at the top of the pyramid as well. And so you really have to level the playing field, and that's impossible in the current system.
Right, right. I have a few questions about, your suggested system, which I was going to get to in the second half of this interview, similar to the format of the book. Maybe just a couple brief points before we get there. You were talking about choosing work or allocating work based on scarcity, and I wanted to get you to expand a little bit on that, because you spend time talking about what artificial scarcity is in the book, and how that leads to exactly what you were talking about with the ensconced privilege at the top and things like that.
Right, right. Artificial scarcity is the output of monopoly or cartel. In other words, where the producers basically rig the market with the collaboration of the state or the central government. And we see this all over the place. We can start perhaps as an example with higher education. In other words, the system is rigged by the cartels of the major universities and the state, the government. And this is global. It's not just a U.S. problem, although student debt is a uniquely U.S. problem. But to get the credential, you've got to satisfy this cartel. And the fact that the credential doesn't really prove that you learned anything in 4 years of college shows that the system is broken. And yet you've got to do the system, follow the rules, and get your credits and all that to get the diploma that you have been told is essential. And so there's a lot of cartels. In fact, I would characterize our entire status quo economy as nothing but a series of monopolies and cartels that are imposed and protected by the state. And this can be the media, which is mostly owned by like 6 corporations. It could be the pharmaceutical industry. All these things are controlled by a handful of players at the top. And the state imposes like thousands of pages of regulations to make it, basically they create a very wide and deep moat for anybody to compete with the existing cartels. And so those privileges create artificial scarcity so that a college diploma that should cost a very low amount of money, basically you should be able to pass a test and say, okay, I've learned all of these things that we expect of a college education. And then you'd be issued your diploma the next day. And so the scarcity of diplomas the artificial scarcity would vanish. So I guess I want to connect up artificial scarcity with the idea that monopoly and cartel is imposed by the government to protect those privileged players. And of course, if you're in the privileged class, you always have an infinite number of justifications for why the system has to stay exactly as it is.
Of course, of course. You reminded me of an incident that happened to me. I'll briefly describe a few years ago. I mean, I've always been interested in Bitcoin, and I wanted to look at where I stood from a regulatory standpoint here in Canada. So I started reaching out to my bankers and my bank manager, and he's like, I have no idea where you would even start. And finally, someone at the Business Development Bank, which is a government entity here, referred me to a lawyer from one of the big four Canadian banks, and he was like an entrepreneur in residence / lawyer. And so he arranged a meeting, and I went downtown to the big bank building in the Sky, and there was about 6 people sitting in the room, and we sat there for a half day. So they were pretty generous with their time, and they just took me through all of the regulatory framework that would likely be relevant to starting a Bitcoin business in Canada. But the interesting thing he said is that, Mark, the way you want to do this is you want to get big backers behind you. You want to have first mover advantage. You want to be talking with the government from the word go to help shape the regulatory policy that you're going to operate in. And then once you're done and you're the first one in the space, you kind of reach behind you and you pull the ladder up behind you. and the ongoing play, he described this very vividly, was a constantly escalating regulatory hurdle that you were already over as the first mover and backed by the big money banks or whoever, and everybody else trying to enter the field would always be on the other side of that hurdle, and you were always moving it up behind you. And I thought, that's how it gets done these days.
That's a wonderful anecdote, because it really captures the essence of the current status quo, whatever you want to call that economic political system we inhabit.
Yeah. One last thing before we talk about CLIM. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to talk about universal income, because you hear a lot of it. Even people who I am close to and frequent with are sometimes they're proponents of universal income, and it's a hard thing to refute sometimes. It's very alluring to many people.
Right. That's an excellent intro to the topic, that it appeals to our innate idealism that we spoke of earlier, similar to sort of undefined sort of grandiose schemes of socialism or communism. And so the idealism around a universal basic income is, if everybody gets paid a flat guaranteed income, they will be free to become artists, musicians, composers. They'll be able to do whatever they wanted in life, and it'll all be wonderful. But there's a couple of huge flaws in this, 2 to be specific. One is human beings in general, that we're coded, if you will, our genetic coding makes us drawn to working with others. We're social animals, so we need to collaborate and we need to share goals and projects. Very few human beings are truly independently wired that they can create consistently, go out there and work 40, 50, 60 hours a week with no feedback, no support structure, and no group around them. That's a rare commodity. And so most people, if we look at the guaranteed income that we have now, which and of course Canada and the U.S. have somewhat different systems, but there are already a lot of people on guaranteed basic income. And in the U.S., it's called disability, or the kind of cobbled together safety net where you get your apartment for 99% of your cost is paid by the government, and then your health care is subsidized, and then your child care is subsidized. And it's basically an equivalent to the guaranteed basic income idea. And if you look at the people who receive this support now, are they happy? Are they creating music? Are they generating entrepreneurial ideas? No, they're actually usually depressed. They're usually caught up in a network of social dysfunction. And so this is our kind of our tell here that that psychologically this is a complete failure. To have the state issue a direct payment to each individual or each household with no strings attached doesn't lead to creativity, entrepreneurship, and artistry. What it creates is social dysfunction, because people need work, and they need work for personal meaning, and they need to be able to contribute to something beyond themselves. And this is the foundation of psychological health and community health. And so just to be given money with no strings attached is actually a catastrophe for human psychology and for the community. And then the second problem with it is, where's all this money going to come from? And the cliche that you always hear is, the owners of the robots are going to pay the taxes. And that just doesn't work on a couple of levels. Number one, what is a robot or automated software? It is a commodity. In other words, that robot that was created in a factory somewhere is a commodity. Your competitor can buy that same robot for the same price and download the free software, and he can outproduce you or produce exactly the same as you in infinite quantity. And so there's going to be no profit.
Right.
Because once something's commoditized, profit margins vanish. Like, for instance, a tablet, like a computer tablet of the kind we all know, 7 to 9 inch, whatever. Well, you can buy one in India or China for 40 or 45 bucks in whatever volume you want. So the fact that it costs you more than that here is just a matter of markup and so on. And the actual components are probably 30, 35, but the profit margin on making a tablet for 40 bucks is wafer thin. So there's not going to be any giant profits from people owning robots. And in fact, as the cost of robots and automation goes down, everybody can become an owner. So the ability to produce in infinite quantities of stuff that is automated or made by robots, there's going to be no profit at all, except at the very localized level. And so there's not going to be any money. And then since we've eliminated a bunch of paid work, the state collects taxes on wages as well. So now you've removed the two primary sources of state income, profits and wages. Those are both in collapse. So where's the money going to come from to pay approximately somewhere between $5 and $10 trillion in guaranteed income?
Well, they'll have to print it. That's the only way. And so when I think this through, and I think, okay, let's say we're headed for a guaranteed income society, you have to print the money, because I read an argument for it the other day that said, oh, we're already this much in debt and we can just borrow this much more and it won't be as bad as, say, Japan. But that kind of misses the point that eventually that debt will break down. Eventually the lenders will not lend, or the cost of borrowing is going to be too high. So you're going to have to print money, or it's going to be a voucher, or it's going to be something that nebulous. And once you're printing money, then, well, what happens? You get inflation. But then the argument to that is, well, where I'm going with this is you would be on a slippery slope into a complete command economy, because you could only do a universal income by printing money. You could only avoid inflation by imposing price controls. And once you're imposing price controls, you're basically 2 steps away from telling everybody what they can and can't spend their universal income on.
Right. And once you go down that command economy, which is even more centralized than what we have now, then what you end up with is somebody that's got some land, say, let's talk about food. So you've got somebody with some acreage and they've got an automated farm, right? I mean, the tractors and all the equipment is automated. It's robots. And so they have a very few small staff. And then you're going to tell them, well, you have to sell us your product, your grain or whatever you've grown at X price. Well, they can also just turn their whole system off and say, you know what, I really don't want to do that. I don't want to like give you all the product of my labor and my investment in capital. And so, what happens is people opt out. The people who are supposed to pay all the taxes and give you the free grain and all that stuff, they simply stop doing it because it's not profitable to them.
Right. And then,
well, go ahead.
You could force them to keep producing, but there's a word for that. It's called Venezuela.
Yeah, and Mark, here's a critical point that I think is the right moment to bring up, which is not all human labor creates a profit. And I'll give you 2 examples. One is like bikeways, right? I mean, we all know that riding a bike if the weather allows is really good. It takes cars off the road. It improves the health of the riders. It reduces consumption of fossil fuels and pollution. Blah blah blah. It's all great. Everybody agrees on that. Well, no one can make a profit building a bike lane. I mean, Google is not going to come in and go, you know what? We're going to take over the world and make billions of dollars by building bikeways. The only way you can make a profit at a bikeway is charging each bicyclist.
Right.
And now,
right.
then what you're creating there is a disincentive to use it, right? Because I'm just going to use the potholed regular street.
Or drive my car.
Yeah, to heck with you and charging me $5 to use your bikeway. I'm not going to do it. So another example is all the stuff that goes into education beyond a teacher and then students sitting in a classroom. And I was just having a conversation with a guy that he's from the UK, but he's currently living and working in Spain, and he said that the parents' organizations there, which are the equivalent of like the PTA here in the States, he says they don't just meet once a month for an hour. They provide a huge amount of labor for the school. Every parent kicks in multiple hours to and handles everything from like food preparation to cleaning so they're not paid. So there's a lot of things that it's impossible to create a profit at that kind of thing unless you have customers who can pay $50 or $60,000 a year for a private school, right? Then you can pay everybody for all those jobs. But my point here is some very large percentage of human life is not profitable. It can't be broken down into a profit. So part of what I had in mind with the CLIM system is what we're going to do is we're going to create a system that recognizes valuable work that may not be profitable. And there's a huge distinction there because when we talk about automation and robots, nobody's going to spend the enormous amount of capital to buy robots to build bikeways if it's not profitable. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to be automated. There's not going to be robots building bikeways, okay? Because no one's going to invest that capital and time if there's no profit. So that's why we're a community group could decide this is valuable work. This will reduce pollution. It will reduce congestion. It will create all sorts of good things, and it has a value even though it's not profitable. And that distinction is lost in our sort of like either or conception of what creates value and profit.
Okay. Well, this feels like a good time to start talking about CLIM itself, the system that you are putting forward in the second part of the book. And as I was reading it, it sounded to me similar to local exchange trading systems of yesteryear. I think there's still a few going today. How are you familiar with those? And do you think it's a logical extension of that, or something completely different?
No, I think it's basically taking those principles and then scaling them up to a global scale and formalizing the rules that make those structures work. And what we, when we talk about the CLIM system, I should mention it means the community labor integrated money economy. And so the basic idea here is we we integrate the community economy, the labor, like paid work, and the money system. Money in this system is created when work creates, needed goods and services. So the money's created at the bottom of the pyramid by people who actually are doing work that's valued by that community, and that community got a say. In other words, it's valuable because the community says, this is what's scarce right here in our community. And so we're going to fill that need, and people are going to get paid for doing that. And if there's a profit to be made, fantastic. We're going to do that too. But and in fact, we want to make a profit because we're all going to benefit from that. But some things that aren't profitable, if there's a crying need for it, well, we're going to do that too. So it's a flexible system, very dynamic, and I think that's what's missing from centrally planned, top-down, centralized hierarchy kind of structures that dominate our lives now. What we need and what works is decentralized, dynamic, where it self-organizes to meet the needs of each particular community, and there's money created that funds that. We don't have to borrow it into existence, and we don't have to beg the state for some dribble of money, and we don't have to sell the rights to some corporation, based in Ireland or whatever for tax purposes in order to get it done. We can just do it ourselves.
Right, right. It was when we were talking earlier about socialism and Marxism. I was going to mention that it's the central planning that kills you in the end.
Yes.
Regardless of what the system is around it. And so here you're proposing a system where decisions are being created at the grassroots level. It's similar to local exchange traded systems of yesteryear. I suppose now that we have blockchain technology, it adds a whole new dimension to this, because you could have your decentralized communities creating, if I understand this correctly, they could use a shared blockchain with other communities. They could have their own, I suppose, as long as there's some liquidity between the various different currencies or whatever, some kind of exchange value. That could be what ties it all together in the various different communities.
Right. That's I have named my currency, my proposed basically digital currency, cryptocurrency, the l'argent, or if we say in French, l'argent, which is the word for money. And that would be the universal currency within the CLIM system. But of course, I anticipate a global marketplace, and in fact, the CLIM system includes a global marketplace that's transparent and open to every participant. That would include currencies and credit, as well as goods and services. So the idea here is, if we can have a universal currency whose value is discovered every moment of every day, just like the ideal in capitalism and what you see with Bitcoin. I mean, you can go to these Bitcoin sites and you can see the bid and the ask transparently. And so that's my idea for the l'argent. And then because you've got to have a currency that people can earn and then use that to go buy some goods and services that they want. And people can create goods and services and know that they can sell them for l'argents. And then once they have the l'argent, which is as you said, a form of liquidity. Then they can go do whatever they want. They want to buy dollars or gold, fine. There'll be somebody that will be willing to sell it to them for the market price, or they can buy, hopefully, goods that are capital goods that will help them create value in their life and their community.
Right. And so I remember now that you proposed the l'argent as the sort of global system, the global currency for climate. And what I posited just before that, I was thinking individualized pockets, possibly with their own local exchange currency, which isn't what you said in the book, so I should differentiate there. I do realize the reason I posited that mentally in my mind brings me to my next question, because if the l'argent is going to be the global CLIM currency unit, how does CLIM get an initial push to even get off the ground? It's like the network effect in reverse. If one person starts a CLIM system, he's kind of nowhere. He needs 1 million people to do it to have any utility to it. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. And so, you raised all the key points here, which is the network effect, which is our way of, it's the term that describes how a network of nodes or people or businesses, which the CLIM system is all of those, it gains its value from the number of participants and nodes. And so if you've got 10 groups, that network is worth X amount. And then if you have 100 groups, the value increases geometrically. And so we see this with for instance, the internet, when only 1% of the population had a 14.4 modem and could get on some kind of creaky bulletin board, the value of the internet was not very great. And then once using the Pareto principle, once about 20% of the population got online and the browser came about, then quickly it scaled up to 80% participation. So that's critical. And I think my own personal view, and I don't know if this will play out in real life or not, but I look at failed states and failed economies like Venezuela as the prime sort of growth market for a system like CLIM. In other words, where a number of community groups or even faith-based organizations, like a church or something, would say, "Okay, you guys, our economy's collapsing here. We've got most of us don't have gold or Bitcoin, and our currency's worthless or near worthless. Why don't we all start a CLIM group, like all 100 of our communities?" And then if you got to that scale immediately, like everybody sort of said, "Okay, we're gonna do this all at once," and then you'd have enough scale to then create value. But yeah, if two people start a group somewhere, that's not going to cut it. It has to be an initial surge, very quickly creating enough groups to create the goods and services that can be traded with other groups.
Right. Because I was thinking when you were describing the growth of the internet and then what happened after the browser came along, I kind of jotted down, so what's the catalyst? And then you started talking about Venezuela and failed states, and I figured, well, there's your catalyst. But where would the technical underpinning that's going to drive that come from? There's got to be a pre-existing platform that carries out or facilitates all of those technical functions you describe in the book. They can't code that from scratch, probably. It would take too long. There's got to be something they can tap into that is as easy as getting a new email address or something like that.
Yes, absolutely, Mark. Yeah. And in the book, I lay out this idea of 5 software engines that basically handle all the functions of the CLIM system, on a global basis, or that they can be easily copied or downloaded by somebody who wants to start a group. So that those 5 engines would cover the community organization itself, like how do you start a group, how do you run the group so that it stays qualified to, get large and pay. You have to do a peer-to-peer accreditation or verification so that you can trust everybody in the system.
Hmm.
And then you need to distribute the cryptocurrency, and then you need a global marketplace for the stuff that people are making and trying to sell. And then you need a transaction clearinghouse, so there's some trusted mechanism for people, getting paid and transferring money around. And so that's the model there for how do you develop that? Well, one model is we can see in real time right now is like Ethereum
Hmm.
and the DAO, like the decentralized autonomous organization kind of model. Um, and so these models are either we could use those software platforms, or somebody comes up and starts funding or self-funding the development of a similar system.
Yeah, I was thinking an open source project would be perfect.
Yes.
Um, you mentioned Ethereum; they're venture backed, as far as I know.
Yeah,
But
made safe, I guess. There are some other
yeah,
ideas out there that are self-funded. You get paid in the currency of the
well, I
system.
mean, Bitcoin. I mean that's
Yeah,
an open source project that sort of started it all. So
that's right.
yeah, I tell my daughter whenever you catch yourself saying somebody should, do something, just remember you're a somebody. So maybe you've got to do it. Maybe you're the one who has to do it. Is what I'm thinking to myself right now as I think this through. But
Yeah, I would like to think that some wealthy person who's skimmed a lot of money off of a startup that they sold to Google or IPO'd or something. I mean, I think it would take a relatively modest amount of money, a couple $100,000, to at least hire some good programmers to code the sort of basic structure, and
mhm,
then from there, it could be open sourced where people would contribute, kind of like Linux.
mhm.
And self-organizes. But there's got to be a catalyst for that, and I don't know what that catalyst will be. But if we present an integrated system that makes sense to, in terms of incentives and in terms of like um, opportunity to create capital and a dynamic, flexible model that requires everybody that participates to have skin in the game, to use Nassim Talib's
Mhm.
phrase. I think it's going to be attractive as the status quo crumbles and erodes around the world. And it will, of course, crumble and erode at different rates and in different ways, depending on what part of the planet you're on. But it will crumble and it will erode. We know that. And we're seeing the signs of it everywhere. So we just need a catalyst. And what my job, and thank you so much for joining the idea that we need to just get this model that there is another alternative that makes sense and that's doable. And if we can get that word out there, then someone somewhere will go, yeah, I think this could work.
Right, right. Well, Charles, I think this would be a good place to wrap things up. I want to, thank you again for letting us do the audiobook version of A Radically Beneficial World. Um, you can download the audiobook version from audible.com and iTunes and Amazon, and Charles's website is of2minds.com, right?
That's right.
And you have another book out, which I'm reading right now, but I can't remember the title. Can you just tell our listener, whoever it is, what it is?
Um, this is kind of rehashing some of my favorite themes. Why our status quo failed and is beyond reform. In other words, there's no way we're going to reform this by some sort of policy tweak. We need a whole new system.
Okay. Can I make that audiobook too?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
And
I'll get less on it.
and Mark, I do want to say I actually enjoy listening to the audio version of my book more than I like reading it.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, Leslie's a great narrator, so he's a pleasure to work with. So I'll get him to do the next one too.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the book, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Charles. It's always a pleasure.